Welcome to the Air Medical Today podcast. My name is Edward Ero, and I am your host for episode 39 on June 3rd, 2021. This podcast is part of the Ero Podcast Network, podcasts that inform by focusing on both the news and the people behind the news. With each episode of Air Medical Today, we explore a specific area of the air medical industry and community through the use of interviews. You can find Air Medical Today on the web at airmedtoday.com and on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Pinterest, and Instagram. The audio podcast is indexed on iTunes and the video version is on YouTube. For additional information about the guests on the podcast, I also provide background data on the Air Medical Today website. If you would like to become a sponsor and/or leave feedback, please write to webmaster@airmedtoday.com or call 612-367-6052. Today I'm interviewing Mr. Craig Yale, the president of the Yale Group, LLC, from Sandy, Utah. Before we get to the interview, I want to go over some feedback from previous episodes and provide some general updates. As I have announced several times before now, Air Medical Today is also a video podcast. As always, you can listen to the podcast and now watch it on the new Air Medical Today YouTube channel. The link to the channel is on the Air Medical Today website. Also new is that Air Medical Today is back on Pinterest and is now also posting on Instagram. So besides Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, you can follow all the air medical transport news and information on all 5 platforms. If you have not listened to past podcasts, please take the time to do so. There's some great information on how many of the large not-for-profit air medical consortium programs operate, as well as how they are reacting and adapting to the COVID-19 pandemic, including handling the stress that this has caused the frontline staff. Please tune in to these informative and timeless podcasts. I would also like to thank the followers of Air Medical Today on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Pinterest, and Instagram. To date, Air Medical Today has 29,227 likes or followers, and it is increasing every day. Thank you so much. It is my pleasure to welcome Craig Yale, the president of the Yale Group, LLC, on the podcast today. Mr. Yale has over 45 years of experience in the development and management of not-for-profit, for-profit, private, and public corporate services that have included both emergency ground and air medical programs. Craig is a paramedic, and his bachelor's degree in business with an emphasis in finance is from Regis University. Mr. Yale has held a number of positions in the air medical transport world, including Flight for Life in Colorado Springs, Rocky Mountain Helicopters, and the formation of LifeNet, Air Methods Corporation, HeliStar in Istanbul, Turkey, and as the president of the Yale Group. Craig has been on the board of the Association of Air Medical Services and currently serves on the board of the MedEvac Foundation International, the Association of Professional Flight Chaplains, and is a Regent and Instructor with the Medical Transport Leadership Institute. Craig was awarded the Marriott Carlson Lifetime Achievement Award in 2016. Welcome to the Air Medical Today podcast, Craig. It's really great to have you on the show.
Well, thanks for having me.
Well, I appreciate you spending some time with the podcast and for people learning a little bit more about you. As I always do on the podcast, I'd like to provide our listeners with some background and experience of the folks I interview. And you have done so much in the air medical transport world. I think this might be a 4-hour podcast, so people get ready because Craig's done quite a bit. Let's start when you started out as a EMT in 1975 and then a paramedic in 79. What attracted you to EMS and where did you do your training?
It's interesting. It was really a situation where I was thrown into it. It wasn't something where I had actually decided that that's what I wanted to do. I was working at a hamburger stand in Laramie, Wyoming at the time, and I just basically couldn't pay my bills. I was going to the University of Wyoming, and I needed a job that worked better with it. And I found out that there was something they called a central service technician up at the hospital that went from 3 o'clock in the afternoon to 11. So I was able to take a full-time position and still be able to go to school. And I went up there for my first day. I hadn't had any training or any real explanation of what it was that I'd been hired for. I used to, like to say that they used just the mirror test. As long as it fogged, they'd hire somebody for it. And the person that was there was coming off their shift, but they were supposed to do some OJT for me. And what he showed me was going around to each of the floors and going to the dirty utility closet and picking up the old stainless steel bedpans, urinals, emesis basins,
Sure.
and then go down to central sterilizing and wash them and then put them back into the clean utility closets. And he said, this will keep you busy tonight, and we'll work on some of the other stuff later. He'd shown me how the autoclaves work, for example. So I've gone around my first day in this job, and I've picked up all the dirty stuff, and I come back down and I'm cleaning out a bedpan of what you would expect to be in a bedpan in my little rubber suit, thinking as soon as I get caught up on my dorm payments, I'm out of here. And a guy comes running by and he springs open the door and he yells, "Let's go, we got a hot one." Well, I was standing there staring at a bedpan trying to conceive of what a hot one could possibly be. And I realized that, there were big steam autoclaves in the next room. Maybe he meant there was a problem there. And he did seem to be for maintenance. So I went ahead and I went out in the hallway and looked, and this was a little extension off the edge of the hospital. And I didn't see anybody. And then pretty soon the door opened up at the end of the hallway, and it was the same guy, and he yelled, "Let's go, we've got a call." And I said, "Call who?" I really had no idea what he was talking about. And he said, "You're on the ambulance with me. Let's go." And I'm like, "I'm not on the ambulance." And he said, "Yes, you are. I'll explain, but get your ass down here." Okay. So I go down there, go into
This is the first day on the job.
First day on the job. Yeah.
Oh,
at this point, I'm about an hour into my new career. And so he explains to me that there are 2 men a night that are picked to be able to be on the ambulance. And you have to stop by the operator station on the way in order to find out who those people are. But again, the requirement was to have a Y chromosome. It wasn't to have any training or education. And so I went ahead and got in the ambulance, and we were on our way down there. He shows me how the siren works and stuff as we're driving. And we go to this hotel in downtown Laramie. It's 3 stories tall, making it the tallest building in town that isn't on the campus. And we go up in an old elevator, and we get to the top and go in to check on our patient, who is dead, rigored dead. And I'm relieved because we don't have to do anything now. And I find out that, we were full service, and we had a body bag that was in the kit. And so we were given permission to go ahead and bring him down. So we put him in the body bag. We stood him up in the elevator shaft because there was no way to get a stretcher in there. And we started down. As we started down, it sounded almost like somebody had thrown a string of firecrackers into the shaft. We heard this bang, 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 bang type of sound. When the doors opened up, we found out what the cause was. There was a guy that was at the counter in the hotel passing a bad check, who was wanted for having killed a state trooper earlier in the year.
Oh my God.
And, we're talking about Wyoming, where murders are very infrequent and murders of police officers are almost non-existent. Anyway, one of the, you have to understand, Laramie had a professional fire department ambulance, and we were the county service out of the hospital. And it was rare that we ran in the city, but they were on another call. And so as a result, you had the city police department show up because it was in the city. You had the sheriff's department show up because we were the county service and they ran with us. You had a person from the state patrol who was passing through, who saw this aurora borealis out in front of the hotel and decided to stop and see what was going on. So you had multiple police officers and jurisdictions in the lobby. Well, one of them walked up to the counter basically to find out if the clerk knew what was going on as far as when we'd be down. And the felon turned around and shot him basically point blank in the abdomen. The other police officers took offense to that, as you might imagine, and proceeded to go ahead and unload their guns towards the felon, hitting him 3 times. So now I've got, I'm an hour and a half into my career and I've got a double shooting to deal with.
Oh my gosh.
And the partner leaves. It's just, I guess, too much stress. He just decided to leave. And so I wound up getting the patients in the back of the ambulance, got a police officer to drive, and we got up to the hospital. Well, the hospital emergency department wasn't staffed 24 hours, so there's a doorbell back there. You push the doorbell, house supervisor comes out. She's one of these people that has, kind of a miniature milk carton on her head, her nursing cap, and had an amazing talent. She could always keep about 2 inches of ash on her cigarette, And so she comes out the door and she's like, "Why didn't you call us?" I said, "I have no idea how to do that." And so I started getting lectured for not having called ahead to be able to deal with it. And after I got through being sort of laced down by her, I said, "Well, if that was fun, you're going to really enjoy the present I got for you back here." So we opened up the doors and, 2 shooting victims. She and I went in. Fortunately, the on-call physician had not left the building yet. And he was a surgeon, actually an incredibly gifted surgeon. And so he makes a decision right away in the emergency department that the felon is not going to survive no matter what happens, and that the police officer needs to go immediately to surgery. Well, they have to call in a surgical team to be able to do it. So he takes myself and the house supervisor into the OR. And now 2 hours into my career, I'm an OR tech helping on a gut-shot police officer in the OR. And of course, I was extremely relieved as the crews came in for the OR and take things over. I was actually happy to go back down and play with my bedpans. So I'm down there again, washing bedpans, and I get a phone call that I'm supposed to go ahead and pick up the dead body of the felon and take it down to the morgue. I didn't know where the morgue was, but they drew me a map so I could do it. So I take the body down to the morgue. I get there, the pathologist is waiting, and it turns out that also one of the other duties that a CS tech did was to be a diener. So about 3.5 hours, 4 hours into my career, I'm now involved in doing an autopsy. Yeah, so it was just kind of a crazy night. By the time I finally got back, got all of the bedpans and stuff washed, sterilized, and back up to the clean utility, it was actually morning. And I still hadn't settled down, so I went down and stormed into the hospital CEO's office. It was somebody that I had met through a relationship with my dad. My dad was a hospital CEO, and so this was somebody I'd met before, but he had no idea that I was working there. Anyway, I went storming to his office and basically said, "I've seen emergency. I know what Roy and Johnny do, and this isn't it. And it's crazy that this is what the citizens have to deal with." And he let me rant for a while, and he said, "Fix it." And I was like, "What?" And he said, "Just fix it." And so at 19, I was basically, put in charge of the ambulance and told to fix this thing.
That is an incredible story.
That's right.
I think I've heard bits of that before, but not the whole thing. And that's just incredible. Your first day. So any of your hamburger skills, did those transfer over at all?
No. I was pretty much a counter and cleaner kind of guy there.
God,
so anyway, the background I picked here is me back then, and you can see the official uniform, good humor uniform of the mid-70s for an ambulance, the white smock, the white pants, and white shoes, because nothing was more practical for an ambulance. Doing a display for some kids from the local area, but that's a fantastic story. Now, was that at Ivinson Hospital then? Yeah, it was at Ivinson Memorial in Laramie, Wyoming.
Yeah, and then you also worked for Mountain Valley Ambulance.
Yeah, Mountain Valley was down in Colorado Springs.
Yeah.
My wife's education took us to Colorado Springs, and initially we thought we were just going to be there for about 6 months. It was kind of an internship type of thing she was doing. Excuse me. And I really didn't want to get into a lot of stuff. We were living in an apartment that was across from a mall, and there was a music store there, which is one of my other passions. And I went over and got a job at the music store. And after working there for a month, the guy's paycheck bounced. So it wasn't much of an option for me to stay. What I did have was I had, an EMT certificate from Wyoming, and I thought I could, get a transfer to Colorado reasonably well and might be able to work on the ambulance. Well, the ambulance system in Colorado Springs at the time was really quite rudimentary. And the only requirement was an American Red Cross advanced first aid to be able to be on the ambulance. And in fact, that was required. So in order to be able to work, even though I had an EMT, I had to go get an American Red Cross advanced first aid card in order to be able to get an EMS license or an ambulance license in Colorado Springs. But I went to work there, and as I like to say, first time I saw Mother Jugs and Speed, I thought it was a documentary, because that was really extremely similar to what it was sort of like. We had a hodgepodge of ambulances that ran from an old, late 40s hearse through some fairly modern, great big boxes. And we were the principal 911 for the community. There were two companies almost always in Colorado Springs at that time. And you got calls based on who was the closest. And so it was an interesting environment. And I started working there as an EMT, started trying to promote the idea of getting everybody else up to EMT. And it was a result of a couple of different things. I think I'd been there probably all of about 3 or 4 months when I wound up being made general manager of the company. So I did that for quite a while. Then I resigned as a general manager to be able to go to paramedic school. Went to paramedic school in 1979. Came back to Mountain Valley and worked as a paramedic there until the opportunity came to be able to start Flight for Life.
Yes. So talk about that. And before you talk about that, what do you think got you into the management side of things? What is it, just that you were always trying to fix things, or that?
I think the problem is I kept forgetting how to duck. It's pretty clear. The first event in the Army, it was just, there was a need. I had a big mouth. I got stuck with it.
Yeah.
In the case of Mountain Valley, I did a lot of things. When I got there, I just saw things that needed to be done. Some of them were literally things like rewiring sirens and stuff like that, because they weren't working on some of the ambulances well. But we were doing 24-hour shifts, and I got bored easy. So I was trying to do things, and I was trying to fix things. And it was a situation where I think I stood out as somebody who wasn't just trying to pass some time there in the eyes of the owner. And so when he decided to make a change at the general manager position, he asked me if I'd take the role. And I saw that as an opportunity to accelerate the changes that needed to be done. And so I think that's really why it was there. I've often said that part of my problem is almost every promotion I've ever had takes me farther away from my passion. And that was that I really enjoyed patient care. I really enjoyed having that contact. And every time I took a promotion, it made it so that I had less of that opportunity. But it also gave me the opportunity to make sure that those people that were doing it had what they needed.
Had to it, yeah. And that's fantastic, because I always like working with staff that, want to think beyond, just doing their job, coming to work, doing their job, and going home, but looking at ways that you can make things better. So let's talk about the.
I've told people many times that there are two things that you need to get out of your lexicon, if you will, if you want to find yourself in a management position. And that is, the first one is, don't say it's not my job. And the second one is, don't say it's not my fault. Okay.
Yep.
If somebody you want to have in a leadership role doesn't worry about whether it's their job, and they don't worry about whose fault it is, they just get it fixed. And as long as that's your attitude, then I think you have the chance to be able to do a lot of change.
Yeah, my two pet peeves are always, the people that say, my bad, or above my pay grade.
Yeah.
No, take some responsibility, fix it. If you're not the one, find the person that can. So let's talk about the Flight for Life program at St. Francis. Then I think that became later Penrose St. Francis. Talk about how that all came into being and why the need for an air medical program.
We had air medical support, if you will, from Fort Carson, from the 571st Mass unit that was there. But obviously, the civilian side was secondary to what they had to do on post. And so that was an issue with it. Also, the time it took sometimes to activate them could be an issue. And at the time, the MAST unit didn't necessarily always fly with somebody at like a paramedic level. And so it was just the inconsistencies around that was part of it. The other thing was St. Francis was a sister hospital to St. Anthony's in Denver. And so what we wanted to do for quite a while was to get St. Anthony's to go ahead and put a satellite program down in Colorado Springs and just operate it. I mean, they were clearly the experts and everything else. But there was some issues between the two CEOs. One of the things to understand about St. Francis at this time is that I think I was about 26. The CEO of the hospital was probably about 29, and our chief of staff was about 29 or 30. And the reason for that was St. Francis had been operated by an elderly nun, and they had brought in a fresh graduate from a MHA program to go ahead and help. And then she decided to retire, and he was given the opportunity to go forward, which was great. Very, very brilliant man. But he was in that position. This was a Catholic hospital that was sort of dying. I mean, it was the smallest of the major hospitals in town. And it was a very, very elderly medical staff as a general rule. And it needed to be sort of retooled. And one of the things that was decided would be a way to be able to differentiate the hospital was to go ahead and specialize in emergency and trauma medicine. And so it became more critical to have an air medical program to be able to support that. Initially, because of the sort of schism between the two hospital systems, we actually went with Roy Morgan and Air Methods to be able to set up the original program.
Oh,
there.
Interesting.
We were going to be, Air Life of Colorado. And the mother house decided that we were basically acting like, spoiled children, and that we needed to work together with St. Anthony's, and that we needed to have the same operator and have some economies of scale, et cetera. And so we had to break the contract with Air Methods, and we wound up going with Air West helicopters out of Fort Collins. That was the provider at the time for Flight for Life. And then shortly thereafter, Air West went bankrupt, and Rocky Mountain Helicopters took over. And so that was our vendor from there on out. But anyway, they decided they just needed to start their own since they weren't getting the support they wanted out of St. Anthony's to put an aircraft there. And I was the closest thing to an EMS administrator that they had in town. So, that I got asked if I would do it. And to be honest, I had thought when I was applying that I was applying for a paramedic position on the helicopter.
Great.
And during the interview, I had that saying come back to me real quickly that it's best to keep your mouth shut and have people think you're stupid, then open it and prove it. I realized that the interview was going a strange way. And then I found out that what they really wanted me to do was to go ahead and come in and help with setting up the Flight for Life program and setting up an EMS education program. And I wasn't positive that I really wanted to make one more move back up into management and away from patient care. And I remember having a very conscious thought that, there were some things that I still wanted to do on my bucket list. I, had not been in charge of a major disaster situation and triage. I hadn't done a crike in the field, for example. There were just some things like that flashed through. I went back out. I got on the ambulance. I'd actually gotten somebody to cover for me while I did the interview. Got on the ambulance, and within an hour, we got a call from another ambulance that had been involved or had taken care of a patient that had been involved in a motorcycle accident and had slid and hit his head in a helmet, but on a curb really severely. And they were worried about his neck and they needed to get an airway in him because he was unconscious. And so the person that was there, the paramedic, had started a crike and had actually punctured the trachea, but wound up not wanting to go further with what was there. They weren't sure that they had what they needed. So I came in and finished the crike and got it under control. And they'd actually, they were just literally like a centimeter away from doing it right. It was just that they backed off. So anyway, I put this crike in, and it struck me interesting that I'd had that thought earlier. And then that evening we had the nation's boarding house catch fire, which was a very large old house in Colorado Springs that was used basically as a boarding house for people with issues, either handicapped, retarded, stuck in a wheelchair, whatever. I mean, it was that type of a place. And we had a couple of fatalities from smoke inhalation that we worked as codes, and other burns, and I wound up being triaged with it. And I remember when I was done with that call, I just looked up and went, "Okay, I get it. We'll try."
You got what you wished for. Wow.
Yeah. So I accepted the position, and in 1983 we got the Alouette, and it was the start of our program. We were actually going with a Twin Star as our primary aircraft, but it took a while to be able to get to that, and as a result, we just a second, I'll fix something here. As a result of that, we started out with the Alouette, which is a beautiful aircraft. I mean, anybody who's ever had a chance to be in one, they just climb like crazy, and they're not particularly fast. I remember times coming in with a patient and watching the ambulance that had been on scene with us also pass us and continue off into the horizon because we were hitting a headwind or something, but still a wonderful one. And so the picture in the background you see there is our Alouette. And in fact, the guy in the puffy jacket there is me. But this was our first ship, and we were only flying single nurse as a guaranteed sort of staffing because of the altitude we were at and because of the altitude we served. I mean, we had a mountain with a restaurant on top of it at 14,110 feet that was 10 minutes off the helipad. So we went single nurse. And then what happened was that I was then the relief if they wanted somebody else. And so I carried had a uniform on the back of the door of my office. And if one of the flight nurses gave me a call, then I'd throw it on and go if I could and provide a second set of hands. Otherwise, what they would do is they would go ahead and usually bring somebody back from the scene if they needed to have, again, second set of hands.
I was going to ask if you did that. Yeah. So did Flight for Life in Denver started with an Alouette too, didn't they?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. They had Alouettes for quite a while actually, and then went to B2 HeliStars.
Yeah. So during that experience, you also started a multidiscipline EMS institute and a regional communication center. Talk about that.
There was a real need for continuing education for all of the EMS agencies in the area. We had lots and lots of volunteer EMS agencies in about a 5-county area around the Colorado Springs area. And what we did was we set up a program where I would utilize paramedics or EMTs in the community that had good education skills. And we would do continuing education at their location. And what that amounted to was we did about 18 classes a month in that 5-county area. And we would go ahead and basically parse out the recertification program, the renewal program for an EMT during that time, as well as some other materials. But it helped. Obviously, with the volunteer services, it's very difficult for them if they've got to come into a central location to be able to do it. It's also quite an issue if they've got to go ahead and, when they're doing their renewal, dedicate a couple of days to it because it means time away from work and time away from home. So we decided to set it up that way. And there were sufficient paramedic programs at the time. There was a couple up in Denver, and there was one that started eventually at the junior college in Colorado Springs. So we didn't worry much about that. We also did go ahead and give EMT courses. We went and did EMT renewals, and we did the IV supplement you could do as an EMT at the time. We didn't really have intermediates per se, but we could go ahead and give some advanced skills to EMTs, and so we did some of that type of training. The communications center was really a result of just need. Obviously, with the helicopter, we needed somebody to be able to go ahead and dispatch it and take the calls. And after we'd had the helicopter program running for a while, some things started to change in the ground side in town. And there were still two services. And of those two services, they tended to align with where they got their medical direction from. And so the other service was aligned with Memorial Hospital, which was the city hospital in town. And one of the services was more aligned with us. Their medical direction came out of St. Francis, and that service was starting to have some problems. They had bought a bunch of new equipment 5 years prior, and the equipment was all getting old and they needed to be recapitalized, and it wasn't really clear where those funds were going to come from. And so I convinced the hospital board that we should add ground to our service and buy this company. We made an effort, an agreement to buy the company, and the owner of the competing service came in with a counteroffer the night before, and the seller agreed to go ahead and sell to them. And I think what he thought was that he had effectively cut us off to where we couldn't get started or couldn't get started for a long period of time, and he would have exclusive rights to the all 911 calls during that time. What he wasn't aware of was that I had not wanted to insult the owners, the sellers of the group that was there, but their equipment, quite frankly, was too tired, to be able to deal with. And I picked up a used ambulance, wheel coach ambulance out of New Jersey, and had brought it in and fairly quietly gone through the process of being able to get an EMS license, because again, I needed that anyway once we would wind up with a service. And so I'd already taken care of that. And I purchased another 6 ambulances from Wheel Coach, brand new ones, to replace what they had. So we found out that the service had been sold. I just went ahead and got a group of guys to go with me down to Orlando. We flew down, we picked up the ambulances, drove 24 hours a night, at straight, came back, got to Colorado Springs with them, got them each certified, and we were in operation 5 days later. And so, with new equipment. So it worked out well. But that was our ground ambulance system.
It wasn't a problem getting another ambulance license?
It wasn't. It wasn't for a couple of reasons. I think the first thing is the county EMS administrator understood that the intent was for us to buy this other service and that we needed to have a license in order to be able to do it. And so it was easier than trying to transfer their license to give us a license. And then we would basically just move the assets into that new service. So nobody, anticipated that there would be this situation where there would be only one for a week, provider in town. So I think that was a piece of it. The other was, it just wasn't that sophisticated of a system at the time. It was, really good-hearted people trying to do the right thing. But a lot of this hadn't really evolved, to where what we think of today as a current system.
So at the time, since this was quite a while ago, were you mainly doing BLS, ALS types of services, or did you actually put the nurse on board if the helicopter was down and do critical care?
We didn't. It was pretty much ALS, BLS. With the ground ambulances. There was certainly the potential to be able to do what you're talking about. And I think there were a few isolated times when we would go ahead and do a recovery of a patient or something when weather was bad. But it wasn't a regular piece. Part of that was just because we had when you're flying single nurse, you've only got like 5 people. I mean, that's your staff, and so being able to go ahead and pull a person off the helicopter and come up with a backup and still cover 24 hours is a challenge anyway. That was a piece of it. The other thing was that we were gifted. One of the first nurses that we hired was Carol Wickman. And Carol Wickman came from St. Anthony's but she was literally one of the first nurses on the very first day that St. Anthony started. And so there was no flight nurse with more experience than Carol. And so she was able to provide just some tremendous education and support, and was just an amazing partner for me all the way through the process with Flight for Life.
Yeah. Well, we're going to keep moving along because this will be a 4-hour podcast if I don't, but it's fascinating learning, how you got started in this. You took a reprieve from working in the EMS side of things and became administrator of development, management, and planning at Penrose St. Francis. Was this something you felt that you wanted to move up further in administration, and why did you?
Yeah, again, it's one of those things that was thrown on me instead of me making a choice to be able to do it. The administrator at St. Francis at the time, Penrose and St. Francis had merged, became concerned about the idea of sort of being the supplier and the receiver, if you will, of patients through the EMS situation. He was concerned about we were being very successful. We'd gotten ourselves up to where we were almost 70% of the local EMS 911 calls. And so he was a little concerned about some stuff from a fair trade practice type of a thing. I think unwarranted, but it was still the concern that was there. The other thought was that it was time to mend fences and basically work with the other ambulance company a bit. And so he negotiated a deal to sell the ambulance company to the other service in town. It was packaged up together, and then all of that was sold to AMR. And in fact, it was really kind of the core that got things going with AMR Colorado and why their corporate headquarters are there and everything else. And in fact, Mark Bruning, who I used to work with as a paramedic, went on to become president CEO of AMR. So it was all part of that roll-up. But what was left now was the fixed wing program and the education. And my compensation was no longer compatible with an operation that size. And so I was offered the opportunity to come into the management system of the hospital. And I've always sort of had a talent for being able to get a kernel of an idea and figure out how to be able to take it forward to make it a reality. That's really been my talent, is to seek opportunities and to exploit them. But that if you put me in a position where I'm just supposed to manage something and make sure everybody's time cards get put in on time, I would encourage anybody that ever puts me in that position to fire me as soon as possible, because it's just not working. So this was sort of a golden opportunity to set up a skunk works and go ahead and figure out what else we could do within the hospital system. It was a time when we were buying points of practice of physicians' offices and hiring their staff and then hiring the physician to cover it. It was the time where we were worried about capitation and what that might look like, and we didn't, know we had construction projects that I helped oversee, and we were also expanding out with a sort of doc in the box urgent care kind of things into the community, and we needed to do that. And we actually got involved for several other things. I mean, we put together a team of professional health, mental health people that would go ahead and do little small plays at schools and look for certain triggers with kids during that might suggest that there was a problem that needed to be dealt with.
Wow.
We had a health and wellness type of a program where we would help with education on good diet and all that type of stuff. And so, I mean, it was a very progressive time, and I enjoyed it because it was a chance to build.
What I found fascinating, Craig, about you is, because we had talked beforehand that, I knew you had a business administration degree in finance and computer information from Regis, but you didn't get that until after all the stuff that you were doing that people were coming out with master's degrees doing. So that's incredible.
Yeah. The CEO of the hospital, and I mean, we used to refer to it as the dirty little secret because everybody assumed I had a master's degree. I never represented that I did, but, let people assume what they wanted to. I was on the 24-year plan for an undergraduate degree. Basically, part of the problem was that I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do. So, I mean, I started out with a declared major in music, and found out quickly that the music department had significant requirements for time that I just simply didn't have, because I was paying all my own bills and living on my own, and anticipating getting married and other things. I just simply didn't have the time to be able to live up to what they wanted. And so I went from there to applied mathematics, which is, again, another passion of mine is math, and really enjoyed that for a while, but started to realize that it probably wasn't where I wanted to make a career out of, that I wasn't cut out for academia, and the other choices were going to take me away from the environment that I liked, which was generally a little more rural, mountainous type of a thing. And so, I mean, I'd be having to look more to a big city and that type of stuff in order to follow that. So I pulled away from that for a while. I went ahead and got involved in computer science for a while, just because it was interesting. And so part of my, I did animal husbandry for a while as a declared major. I thought maybe I wanted to be.
Now that's something I never knew.
Yeah. So anyway, when I transferred the credits to Regis, the person that was there said, "So what's this fairy sciences?" And I said, "No, it's farrier sciences." And she said, "Well, what?" And I said, like horseshoes and that type of stuff. And she said, "Oh, PE credit." So I saved me having to do a PE credit. But at any rate, part of my problem was I just couldn't figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up. And then ultimately it just came down to the fact that I wanted to finish it. I didn't want to leave it incomplete. And so I was actually right at the end of the time with Penrose St. Francis, literally in the last couple of months, and getting ready to move to Utah with Rocky. And I took some accelerated classes in order to be able to finish. And I got my degree. And again, nobody's ever asked me for it. The only people that ever asked for my degree was actually the country of Turkey, as they were trying to validate my visa in order to be an administrator there.
Yeah, and we're going to get to that. Well, so talk about your time at Rocky. I know you were vice president of corporate development, but you were also involved with the creation of LifeNet, which was the first, I think, community-based program.
Yeah. I was sitting one night thinking about the inefficiency of the air medical system that we had. The general air medical program had a dispatch 24 hours a day to handle 1 hour worth of work, if you were doing a call a month type of a thing. And so you were giving all sorts of busy work to these communicators in order to try to fill the rest of that time. You had a crew that was sitting around, a lot for usually one call or something to that effect. There was a lot of other administrative overhead that was involved. The billing costs, billing was unique, and therefore it was usually not done well by a hospital. And the talent that was needed to understand the type of things that went into the air medical billing generally just wasn't there. The size of our bills at the time were not big enough to be particularly important, and so you'd see people in the billing office chasing, a $200,000 account, which made sense, as opposed to what might be a $5,000 or $6,000 ambulance bill at the time.
That was my experience at hospital-based programs. Yeah. And
so what I thought was, wouldn't it be great if we could share those redundant overhead things? And so I approached the other air medical programs in the state. And what I found was they all thought it was a great idea as long as it was their dispatch program or their billing or their program director that would go ahead and be the one to operate the effort. And so it's just the parochialness of the business made it difficult to do it that way. And so I wrote up a business plan that I called LifeNet. And in it, the concept was that an operator could provide other services than just simply an aircraft and pilots that would add some efficiency to a program. If they had a major communications center, if they had a billing office that could bill for the air medical and do that under contract, with them. If they could provide education services, that could be spread across, that this would give a differential advantage to that operator, and that they would be able to, potentially get more business. And that at the nexus of all of those different things that they were offering was the ability to go ahead and provide a pure turnkey to a hospital, which included the medical side. And I took that to Rocky, and Rocky had just come out of their bankruptcy. They had new investors. The investors realized that, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you always got. And so they saw this as an opportunity to do some retooling. And Rocky had the vision to go ahead and stick with it, because I can tell you those first few years, it was not a profit center. We were gifted with an opportunity, and that was that Creighton University, St. Joe's, and the University of Nebraska had some desire to try to figure out a solution other than, competing against each other every day. The two helicopter pads literally were within sight of each other across Omaha. And so a couple of very farsighted administrators associated with each of the two programs were willing to go ahead and take the time to sit down and figure out what it could look like. The initial effort was to try to do something that looked more like a consortium type of a model. And it just got more and more complicated as things changed, as ownership changed within a couple of the hospitals, as other parties got to the table. And ultimately, it wound up becoming a situation where they decided that the NUCO, as they called it, needed to be just the Rocky would provide the service. And so we went into a situation where we were providing the medical crews, the dispatch, the billing, everything. It was full turnkey, with an advisory board made up of the two hospitals. And it was just a critical opportunity because it provided proof that two major academic hospitals were willing to trust us to be able to operate a program. And where we had already had a program they received, Rocky received as a result of the bankruptcy, this Eagle program that was in Arizona that became LifeNet there. It was literally a situation where they had a customer that paid off his debt by just giving them the company. And we experimented with a couple of other programs, one on Redding, California, and one in Albany. We now all of a sudden had enough medical people that we could be serious about it. And then it expanded from there. I mean, you got to believe it's an incredibly easy sale to go into an administrator's office and say, what do you figure you're losing on the flight program this year? $1 million, $2 million. How about if we go ahead and take over the FTEs, provide you with the same aircraft in the same colors, the same name and everything else, and just operate it that way. And we take full risk for the expenses of it through billing and collecting. And at the time, because of the volumes, we could do that also at a price that was compatible with where they were at. And so it just evolved. And as you know, really since the mid 90s to now, there's been extremely few new hospital-based programs.
Right.
So it just was a effective alternative at the time. It was an alternative that I think got corrupted a little bit, because when you take a look at the concept, it basically had pure inelasticity in pricing. You could charge whatever you wanted to charge. And so if you were inefficient or your volumes were low, you just simply raised your charges in order to be able to deal with it. And you got to believe that is like a unicorn. It's incredible for investors to find something that has that type of inelasticity, and that you can just go ahead and raise your rates as necessary. And there's some bad players out there, I think, that took advantage of that. But in general, it was mostly just trying to deal with certain inefficiencies in the model. And, if you have low volume, you have to raise your charges, because Medicare is going to pay what they are. Medicaid is going to pay what they're going to do. Self-pay is going to pay what it is. You can't change it. And when that becomes like 60% of your payer mix, you have to have a escalating charge in order to be able to recover from the commercial group that you've got. And the sad truth is if you're going to operate a credible program in a community where you're doing 15 flights a month, you're going to have to charge $45,000, $50,000 as a commercial charge in order to recognize something probably close to around 10 or 11,000 per transport, which is probably what your cost is.
Yeah, we'll get into that with because I want to talk about balanced billing. I think part of the issue with that people will critique it is that if there's an oversupply of helicopters, your volumes go down and charges go up too, because it's such a heavily fixed cost business. And, we don't have in the United States, like there is in Canada or other places where there's only so many helicopters that are allowed to operate. But how many programs did Rocky have in a traditional model before LifeNet was started? Do you remember approximately?
I don't remember I know that we were at about 60 helicopters.
Okay.
And obviously there were some programs that were 2 or 3 helicopters, and some of that 60 was spares. But if I were to have a gut guess, I would say maybe around 40 programs.
Yeah, because I know when I first got into the industry, Rocky was quite big. It's so consolidated, and goes to my next question. 2002, Air Methods, of course, acquired Rocky, and then you went over to Air Methods, where you became vice president of business and compliance. Talk about that. You were still involved with the alternative models, though, too, and you consolidated those.
Yeah, it was an interesting time. I'd actually, for the last year of time I was at Rocky, also had the billing and collection service reporting to me as one of my sort of extra duties. And when I came over to Air Methods, that tracked and followed over. And then I hired Mark Keene to go ahead and take that over at one point into it. But so it was sort of one of those titles that just let me do everything. I was sort of the utility player. I could do whatever position they needed me to for whatever the sort of crisis du jour was. And I did the compliance. We got big enough. We got a lawyer. I didn't have to do the compliance anymore. I did the billing. We got big enough. We got the right person there to be able to do it. So basically, I had a career path that was try to work yourself out of everything you're doing so somebody else got the job. But there was never any lack of opportunity to go ahead and chase something. And I deliberately avoided the title of business development, because that tends to have a very sales type of an orientation to it. So the corporate development was building the corporation, figuring out what more we could do, what were opportunities for improving, and so that's what I followed, was that type of a path. It was, again, the same sort of, firefighter, give me an opportunity, chase it, fix it, build it, and move on. For a period of time, clinical reported to me, so helped set up some management for that. And so it was sort of do whatever was asked that day.
How many LifeNet, when Air Methods took over, how many LifeNet helicopters were there, or programs, do you know? Or can you remember?
And I'd have to guess, but we're probably somewhere around 20.
Yeah. And then Air Methods had experimented with some alternative beforehand.
Yeah, they'd acquired a couple companies, is what they'd done. They bought Mercy Air out of California, which was sort of a independent program in the way it was done. And they bought Archer Medical, which was a consortium at the time.
St. Louis.
And so they had those two entities that were up and operational and owned by Air Methods. So they were an alternative, if you will, at that point, at least alternative ownership. And I think what LifeNet brought the realization of, and why Rocky was an attractive acquisition for the folks at Air Methods. Remember, Air Methods had just recently become a publicly traded company at that time.
That's right.
And I think what they were interested in was that by putting that all together, they were now a very legitimate sort of coast to coast type of a thing, because we had our bases out in Albany and places like that with LifeNet. And that it showed that this could be something on a national scale instead of sort of a local one-off type of a thing. And so then the first thing that we had to do is we had to figure out how to bring that all together. I mean, we had 3 different patient reporting things. We had completely different communication centers. We had Rocky had already invested in the one in Omaha, which made it a reasonable one to work with. Mercy had a really good facility to be able to do billing and collections out of. And so we basically did that. The one out of Missouri that we were talking about, Archer Medical, had an amazing aviation group that was there. And so the DO and the DOM both came from Arch. And it really was a neat opportunity to try to bring that together. But I got to tell you, it was also a situation where everybody had extreme pride in their own systems.
Yes.
And it took a while to be able to negotiate a common platform.
I've always felt that about Air Methods, because later with acquisition of corporate jets and OmniFlight, I mean, just merging all these cultures is incredible. But I think you at the time, were you taking kind of the best out of each of these areas and trying to put it together into one?
Yeah, that was a big piece of it. I mean,
yeah,
and fairly standard sort of facilitator practice. I mean, the first thing you do is you get the 3 groups to define a mission statement, and then once you got that in common, then it's a little easier to move on. And then you go ahead and you wind up with a common value statement so that everybody sort of agreed to what that is. And then if you use those as your principles, then you use that as the filter against what it is that you want to accomplish. And if you spend time getting the people to where they know each other and they're comfortable with each other, then it's easier to be able to talk about best practices. And
yeah.
Basically that's what we did.
Yeah, having done mergers myself, I know how difficult that is, but how rewarding it is when you can get it all together. So you moved on in 2006 up to the senior team at Air Methods and responsible for corporate and international development. What types of things were you working on then?
Part of our problem was Air Methods was getting so big. You talked about the acquisitions and everything else that, we had to make 2 passes at buying OmniFlight with Hart-Scott-Rodino, the federal antitrust group that has to go ahead and evaluate something like that and decide whether or not you're becoming a monopoly or not. And basically, we were able to go ahead and go forward with the acquisition of OmniFlight, but with a sort of background statement of you don't have room to do this again. And so we started finding ourselves in a position where growth had to be organic, and that the likelihood of another big acquisition was unlikely. There was a chance for some small tuck-ins in different places, but a big one was less likely, at least. And so we started looking at what else we needed to do. Air Methods got into tourism. They went ahead and they bought Sundance helicopters out in Las Vegas.
Yes.
And they also bought Blue Hawaiian out in Hawaii. And, the thought was that would be a great sort of farm camp, if you will, for pilots, because we could go ahead and get these guys and they'd be flying the line with one of the tourism places. And then, in our own arrogance, we thought, and then of course they'd want to come over to be EMS pilots as soon as an opportunity, got there. We found out was that wasn't the way it worked. These people, they liked what they were doing. They liked the job they had. They liked the fact that they were constantly flying during their shift instead of maybe getting a chance to have a flight out of every 3, shifts that they worked or something like that. They were compensated reasonably well and they got big tips, so it turned out not to be quite so much that. It did though, however, because of the type of fleet and the fleet size and everything else, continue to have some advantages for the company, but it was an attempt at diversification. The other diversification that we looked at was international. And so I had with Rocky done a couple of things that were international. I had worked with a project that we did with Albert Einstein Medical Center in Brazil, and this was back in 95. And we brought an aircraft in, a BK in order to be able to support them and support during the time that there was a very large international boat race that was happening at the time, and support that. So we worked with a partner there. Again, the problem was that there just wasn't the type of insurance systems in place to be able to make sense of it from a pure commercial standpoint, at least at the size that we were anticipating. And so eventually we wound up just bringing the aircraft back and stopping that program. At the same time, we were working with an entrepreneur associated with National Airlines down in Chile. And so I was going back and forth to Chile fairly regularly, trying to help set up a program there. The stories around that are incredible. I mean, I basically got hijacked by a group of people at one point that represented themselves as who I was supposed to be working with, and we found out that we were sort of married to two groups down there. Again, a long story to try to get there, but we wound up having to go ahead and get lawyers involved and sneak Russ Spray and myself out of the country about Christmas time
Wow.
that year. I came back down after it had been all cleared up. Just a fun story. I'm sitting on the airplane, and it's taking longer than expected for the door to open up. And the door finally opens up, and a person comes in who's in what appears to be a military uniform, shoulder boards, scrambled eggs, all that kind of stuff on his shoulders. And he talks to the flight attendant, who then points at me.
Oh, no.
This is good. So anyway, he walks over to me and he says, "You Vice Presidente Rocky Mountain?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Come with me, jail." I said, "No jail." I was scared to death. I think I'm on United. I haven't gone through protocol. I think I've still got, protections as a U.S. citizen because I've not actually come into their country yet. And he said, "No jail?" And I said, "No jail," And the person next to me said, "He's trying to say your name because the Y is a J sound in Spanish."
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'd done that. And so I already had some experience around it. And as we got into things at that time, we were approached by several folks, some folks from India, folks from China, some folks from Turkey, folks from Sweden that were interested in seeing what could happen. And so I started focusing on those, and we started looking at potential for acquisitions. And we wound up with a partner in Turkey, Bachelor Holdings, 30 Yildiz, a very, very sharp and innovative man. And we set up a joint venture to be able to go ahead and go forward. Would you like me to get into the stuff about Turkey?
Yeah, because that was 2013, right? That you became the CEO of the joint venture.
Right. Now, technically, at that point, I left Air Methods because the joint venture was a separate company. The company was 51% owned by Bashira Holdings and 49% by Air Methods, which has some significance. The one thing it did was it allowed majority ownership by a Turkish entity, and that allowed the air carrier certificate to be able to be legal. You couldn't have an air carrier certificate in Turkey or in most EU nations if you had more than 50% ownership by a foreign entity. And so when we set up the air carrier certificate there for HeliStar, that was one of the necessities to be able to deal with it. So it was, again, a separate company. I wound up being seconded, or really more officially, just I resigned from Air Methods and wound up being the CEO of the joint venture.
Oh, I thought you still were with Air Methods. I didn't realize that.
It comes down to sort of how you have to do it officially and what you don't do. Air Methods was sort of the pay agent for it at the time because I still was paid in US dollars in the United States.
I see.
I got benefits through them through a back contract through HeliStar to Air Methods because we had to be very careful about how that was done to be legal. There was foreign tax balancing that had to be done between the two corporations. And so there was a technical way that I was still attached to Air Methods so that I could do all of that. And at the same time, have sufficient arm's length relationship that I reported to a board that was made up of Air Methods and Bashara Holdings, as opposed to reporting to, the normal group. Now, the fact was, at least one point in time, Aaron Todd was the chairman of the board of the new HeliStar. So, I mean, it seemed like it was all the same, but again, it was technicalities to be able to have a foreign corporation.
So what are the types of things you did there? I know you were at Augusta Service Center.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. Fisher Holdings was, and it was called Con Aviation was the name of the aviation component of what was going on. And part of what happened when we first got there, and this was actually even before I'd moved to Turkey, we knew that the EMS contract was coming up. It was going to be like 17 aircraft for the country of Turkey, EMS ones. And it was going to be a 3-year initially contract. The current operator that was there had bid the 3-year contract the first time at 150 million euros and was operating fewer aircraft. And so, the message that we'd gotten was that they wanted more aircraft for basically less money. And so we did something that was sort of a piece of sort of game theory, if you will, almost. I needed to be able to get a air carrier certificate that was operating at a reasonable scale in order to be able to bid on the contract for Turkey. And I also wanted to just, if you will, set the scale for what might be happening as far as bidding on it. And so there was an opportunity to bid on a utility contract with the electrical authority in Turkey. And this was to monitor 150,000 kilometers of power line and do video, stills, coronal, et cetera, type of infrared, stuff with it. And we bid it with 119 koalas instead of, cheaper, smaller aircraft that most people would do. And part of the reason that we felt we could make that work if we wound up with a contract was that the 119 Quali was able to go ahead and haul basically everything up at the same time. And we'd be able to make 1 pass per wire instead of 4 or 5 passes per wire.
Oh, interesting.
We could get some efficiencies out of that. But we also bid it reasonably rich because what I wanted, since it was going to be an open bid and people were going to know what it was I kind of wanted the people that were going to bid on the EMS license to go ahead and think that, we were an American company and we wouldn't be competitive, that we'd just be expensive. And this was all with, counseling and advice of FERDA. And we wound up with it. So all of a sudden we've got this contract now to be able to deal with it in something that I had no experience in utility. FERDA didn't have experience in utility. Our methods didn't have experience in utility. And I found out that it was one of the largest utility contracts that was ever led. So with the help of Augusta, because we needed to do some TC type of stuff in order to be able to deal with some of the changes we did to the 119 to be able to make it happen, we were able to get the contract and do it and cover it. So that was our start. It also wound up because we were unsuccessful in getting the EMS bid. My primary amount of business was doing that while we were over there. The EMS contract was kind of interesting. As I said, the old bidder, the one that had been there before, the incumbent, and the one that had started with Turkey, their contract had been 150 million euros. We bid in probably about 20 million euros below that for more aircraft and thought that was a really good bid. And the incumbent bid almost identical to our bid as far as we had. And then somebody else who was not in the business and didn't have any experience doing EMS went ahead and bid 90 million euros, which wasn't sufficient to be able to do it. Yeah. But they got the contract and they wound up having to do a lot of adjustments. They got in trouble for doing sort of garage built interiors for their aircraft and non-certified interiors. And ultimately the person that was the director wound up going to prison. So it was kind of an ugly thing, but we didn't get the contract. So then we started spending more time working on opportunities of acquisition. Air Methods had gone ahead and made a deal to be able to buy a company that was providing services in Finland. We had looked seriously at one in Sweden. We looked at seriously at one in Norway. We looked at opportunities. There were in Italy and Ireland and et cetera. And the problem that it kept coming back to was the way that a U.S. public corporation had to deal with the finances. And because they didn't have controlling interest in the company, they couldn't consolidate the financials. And what that meant was anytime HeliStar would go ahead and incur debt of any sort by acquiring an aircraft, buying a company, whatever it was, 49% of that debt would show up on the balance sheet of Air Methods, but none of the revenue, none of the sales, none of the expenses of it could be consolidated on their financials. And that could be explained in notes, but the problem is, again, people looking at the company tended not to see that much detail. It just looked like Air Methods was invested in something that was costing them a lot of money and incurring a lot of debt, but not giving them anything back. And so that was a problem unto itself. But you also, if you remember at that time, Air Methods was also challenged with a very activist investor who was going ahead and challenging. Air Methods even took out a full-page ad in the Wall Street Journal challenging the decisions that they were making and suggesting
Yes,
they
I
needed
remember
to sell
that.
the company. So it was not a good time for Air Methods to have anything that just challenged, the value of the company and what it looked like. And since we really had difficulty trying to solve that problem, there were some ways we could have, but it wasn't happening. And so I called for a meeting of the shareholders, and basically we structured a situation where Air Methods sold their interest to Bachelor Holdings. And at that point, I needed to decide whether I was going to go ahead and stay. And it was the right time for me to come home. It turned out that politically, it was also a very good time for me to come home, because a month after I left was when the bombing happened in Ankara, and shortly thereafter, the attack on the airport at Ataturk. And it was there during a very wonderful time, and it's probably good that I left when I did.
Yeah, I remember you talking about that and some of the politics that were going on in Turkey. And so, but what a fascinating experience to have that kind of international. And you brought to MTLI somebody from the company too, didn't you? 1 year?
I did. I brought basically my COO, who was the daughter of the other partner. And a brilliant lady. I mean, very young, but probably one of the smartest, people I've ever been around. She's really smart. And it's offered other opportunities. I mean, if you remember George from China, I was working on a project in China, and Gangang, or George as he's known, came over and went through the class and wound up getting the highest score we had that year on the test. I continue to work with George. We're working on an attempt right now to be able to put together a school in China that is very similar to MTLI. Obviously, COVID and some of this other stuff has slowed the project down, but he's working for a person who is quite wealthy, who wants to be sort of a benefactor to EMS and is willing to help this thing get started. And so once things settle down a little bit, I think we'll probably get more involved there. And then I've been involved with a gentleman that's been working very hard to try to get an air medical program going in India. He did a short start with AMGH, or what's GMR now. And basically, because of the sale of AMGH and some other things that were going on, it sort of fizzled, and they brought the aircraft back. And he's now working to try to get another partner in there. But I continue to help him just on a pro bono basis to try to get things up and operational in India. That's
fascinating. Well, let's jump forward here. So in 2016, you formed your own company, the Yale Group, out of Utah, where you live, as the president. Talk about the kind of work that you're doing and some of the consulting you've done with clients. I know you pulled me in on one project along with Clinton Burley from HealthNet to talk about consortiums and how they operated. So, but talk about what you've been doing.
Well, again, my basic skill set and what I offer to clients is I solve problems or I take advantage of opportunities. I help them figure out how to be able to do that. And so, they get somebody with 45 years worth of experience in EMS, and they get it by the hour. So, that's attractive to hospitals who are going through things. A couple of times I've been asked to sort of be an interim as they're looking for a new leadership. My personal belief as far as interims go is just that it's not a great thing to do, because if you're a good interim, then you just have one more separation at the end of that time. And, if you're bad interim, then obviously it's a bad experience for everybody. What I would rather do is accept a position as a coach during that time and work with the leadership that exists in the program through the time it takes them to decide whether they're going to advance somebody within their own organization or go to the outside and help with it. And I'll help them with the selection process. But again, I don't like the idea of being an interim. I'm much happier being a coach. And I think one of the things that happens then is we all tend to be a little blind sometimes to who that person is in our own organization that's got an amazing skill set. And just quite frankly, because they've not been asked to do it, you miss the opportunity to have that person. And so again, being a coach for the, people that are there to help them get through that period frequently allows that person to come to the surface. And so I like to do that. So that's one role I've played. As you said, I've helped in a couple of cases trying to work on the expansion of programs into consortiums, situations where, again, they're trying to figure out how to get some economies of scale, how to be able to improve the situation. You can't collude, in business. And so it's a delicate line to walk when you're dealing with two programs that already exist that are operating within a region, because obviously some of the efficiencies that you're looking at are the fact that you're reducing one of the players in the area, and you can make decisions relative to placement of aircraft and that type of stuff. You might not be, continuing to compete with two aircraft in the same county that you might have before. And you have to be careful, because what you don't want to do, you don't want to, again, during the process while you're working on the consortium, do something that, would be collusion or market distribution. So again, having had that experience, having had a lot of counseling from lawyers and stuff over the years as we did mergers and acquisitions, it gives me the opportunity to do that. I have a client that I'm working with that is Intermountain Healthcare here out in Salt Lake. Incredibly enjoyable to work with a client that I don't have to get on an airplane to go see. But Intermountain's a large program, the LifeNet program. They're have multiple rotor and fixed wing aircraft. They have a CJ4 that they use for longer distances and organ procurement and that type of thing. And I've been working with them, and we've been continuing to expand. And they're going to take delivery of a 604 Challenger here, hopefully hopefully this month. That's set up with two critical care bays in it, and the Challenger is capable of basically going anywhere in the world. And so, it's going to be another sort of market that we're going to spend some time trying to develop, is the international market. There's a lot of opportunity because of growth that's happening here in the Salt Lake area, and a lot of international companies that are based here, that we believe that it's going to be a reasonable opportunity. And it's consistent with the mission that Intermountain has. And the most recent opportunity I've had with them is to be part of the due diligence team for the acquisition of Classic. I mean, that was announced.
Right. Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. The
close, is likely to happen here this summer, and it's a big expansion. 29 extra aircraft that come in with a Classic situation. So even though Classic will operate as Classic and continue to be a separate entity under the separate enterprise under the way things that are there, you're now talking about between the two certificates, Intermountain Healthcare being a major vendor now, if you will. And they are a bit of a vendor with this acquisition, because Classic has provided aircraft for hospital-based programs, and they also have the contracts with Puerto Rico and Haiti. So it really, really stretches if you will, what Intermountain's been involved in. They're going to want to see growth, and they're going to want to see an opportunity to capitalize on that. And because of the way things work, that even though classic, if you will, is a LLC type of a structure, as long as the work that they're doing is beneficial to the mission of Intermountain Healthcare, it makes them a not-for-profit by virtue of the transference of that. And so there's going to be a change in business attitude as it deals with it, as it relates to charges, as it relates to need, as it relates to where they put aircraft. But it literally puts Intermountain in a position to be a not-for-profit vendor. And I think that's going to be an interesting evolution in the industry.
Yes. Intermountain really seems to be on the move in a lot of ways. I think people were surprised by that, because it was very different of anything we've seen in the industry. And they were also, made news here in the Midwest with the potential merger with Sanford.
Right.
And then that, I think, I don't know, all the details went sour because the CEO of Sanford left, and it fell through. But I thought, wow, that's very interesting. That's quite a geographic area.
It's a very entrepreneurial organization. And Dr. Mark Harrison, who's the CEO of it, has just intense vision. I mean, it's really amazing. Another thing that your watchers might be interested in sort of looking up is Civica RX. And I mean, this is a situation where Intermountain said, we don't like what's happening as far as the shortages with the various medicines and that type of stuff, and the, grossly inflated charges and whatever. And he decided, fine, we're just going to become our own pharmaceutical company.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not talking compounding. I'm talking about actually producing the ones that are out there, mostly generics, and wound up with some other senior hospital partners to help get it together. And I think something I read the other day is like 200 hospitals now that participate getting their medications through Civica RX.
Wow.
So, I mean, it's just, he is really good about thinking outside of the box. And he's got a management team that I am super impressed with every day that I work with them, but they have a entrepreneurial flair to them that is amazing.
Yeah. So how in general have you liked being out on your own in the consulting world? I know consulting sometimes can be feast and famine.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly the advantage that, I planned on retiring when I was about 60. And so I financially had set myself up so that when this stuff finished with Turkey, I chose basically to, again, go out on my own because I didn't really need to do anything else. And so it's really nice to be able to pick your projects, pick who you're going to work with, and that type of thing. The thing I would say that's the downside to it is I'm so used to being able to be the person who builds something and puts it together, that the part about being a consultant is you basically give your opinion and then you're expected to walk away. And, I find myself frequently involved in these projects where all of a sudden I have to remind myself that, I don't work for them directly. I cannot make this decision.
Yeah.
And that's a little difficult because when the juices get flowing, that's where I want to be.
Knowing you, I can see that. But you're also a very good coach too, and that's an important skill to have. Do you work with other consultants in the industry when you're working on projects? Yeah,
I do. I part of what I set up Yale Group to do, and even the name I'll have to share with you in a second what happened with, but I was talking with a couple of folks that were actually international members of AIMS. And we were talking about the fact that there really is sort of a opening or an opportunity here, that there is one consulting group that really has a name in this area. And I mean, Fitch, it's hard to deny that. They've got a really strong product, and but there's capacity, and I mean, it's not that they have the capacity for everything, or they're necessarily there. And so I also felt that what we were offering was a little bit unique. And so basically the way we set the system up is it's an LLC so that I can have foreign parties involved if I need to. We can go ahead and move it up to a different type of corp if we have to at some time in the future. But the ability for me to be able to subcontract to somebody and them to then have, by virtue of the fact that it's going through the Yale Group, have the insurance, the errors and omissions, that type of thing, liability insurances, to be able to do it, offers an opportunity to people who would like to work on a project but don't want to make a career out of consulting. It also allows people that have a consulting situation. For example, you had Michael on
Yes,
in a
like
previous
Benton.
episode.
Mhm.
We had a client that wanted to be able to use them. The problem is that they have a very strong, difficult program to go through in order to be able to get a contract with them. And it can take months to be able to get a contract through and approved. And so by me subcontracting with Michael, it's still the Yale Group, which has a contract with his client, that's providing the service. And then Michael sub to me. And, my goal is for him to get his own contract with this client. A normal consulting group would think that to be crazy, because what you don't want to do is, introduce another consultant to your client and have them basically push you out of the way. I'm at a place in my life where, in my mind, that's a success. I think that's wonderful if they get a contract with them, and my client is now benefiting by having something with somebody that I directed them towards because I thought it was a good person and a good consulting situation. And so, it's a platform to be able to work from. I
Yeah.
was initially, again, in these conversations with the other people that will likely be subcontractors at some time and go on and expand in what they're doing, talking about having something that was sort of a grand name, whatever that would be. But they actually pushed me towards the idea of Yale Group because they said, it's a known brand. You're known because of just how long you've been in the industry, and that there's a certain value in being able to go in, and say that it's the Yale Group. And although that sounds to me incredibly egotistical, it's actually proven to be a useful brand.
Yeah. Just as long as it's not the jailed group, right?
Yeah. Well, actually, it's a funny coincidence. I mentioned earlier that my dad was a hospital CEO.
Yes.
When he retired, he set up a consulting practice they called the Yale Group. So one of the advantages I have is this is a group that's been in common use in the marketplace going back to the 70s. So
Wow. Interesting. So I want to talk about some of the association work and other things you've been involved with. You've been involved with AIMS, or the Association of Air Medical Services, from back when it was called the American Society of Hospital-Based Emergency Air Medical Services. Whoever
very
came up
good.
with that name, I mean, ash beams. Were you one of the founding members of the association?
Not directly. I mean, the founding group, got together, I believe, in San Diego, and started out with sort of an AMTC type of a thing. It wasn't what it was called at the time, but I understand from the people there, we're talking card tables and that type of thing was the original one, and a dozen or more people, but it was a small group that came up with the concept. Nina Merrill, who had been with the program in Long Beach, came on as the first executive director.
Right.
And their second meeting that they had was a little bit larger, and I got involved with the third conference, and that's when I started to get involved.
I see.
Shortly, it also dealt with sort of who the presidents were. Joe Tai was the first one that was there. But then you had Carl come in, and Carl had Colorado connections. And then you had Dan Reich come in. Dan Reich was the program director for St. Anthony's. And Dan basically called me up one day and said, I'd like to get you involved with AIMS, and I'd like to have you chair the Finance and Reimbursement Committee of AIMS. And you got to remember, at the time, I think I was like about 28, 29 years old. I thought, oh my God, there's got to be somebody who's more of an expert in this than me. And now, I decided I needed to be involved. And so I got involved, and then shortly after that wound up on the board. So I've been involved with AIMS since its very beginnings, but not the beginning.
Yeah. And you've been on the board 3 different times, right?
Right. I've termed out 3 times. And I've enjoyed it all. I think the organization's mission is appropriate. I think there's a need to have a voice for the industry. It certainly had its challenges, and we can talk about that. But I think that in the aggregate, that AIMS has helped with innovation and was there at the right time for a lot of things that needed to be done. And I believe it can be great. So
yeah. The how have you seen, in general, the association change over the years, and how do you think the current administration is doing?
Yeah. One of the problems that I think, this is Craig speaking, but I think that AIMS has always struggled a little bit with schizophrenia around its identity. That there's a period of time with AIMS where it was all about sort of supporting industry growth. There was a period of time where it was about trying to figure out if it could be sort of more legitimate with more research and that type of a thing. There was a period of time when we wanted to be all things to all people, and we would have the big conference, but then we'd have a mid-year conference that was more business related and what was going on. One of the interesting things about AIMS is that it tended not to focus enough on the clinical aspect of what was going on. It was sort of an organization that acted like it was a trade organization. And as a result, it tended not to meet enough of the clinical needs. And so you had things like the National Flight Nurse Association, which of course has evolved since then, pull away. That was really the first group to go ahead and say, look, we're fine, we're happy, we'll be part of AIMS, we'll participate in the conference and everything, but we really need somebody focusing on our profession. And so they went ahead and set up, and that was sort of part of the first schism. And then you had things like AMPA formed, because again, their needs just weren't being met within the structure that we had. And then you had the communicators and the paramedics all, set up their own organizations. And for a while, again, although they were all separate, we sort of acted like we were a federation. Not that we ever accepted that, but I mean, that was really sort of the model that existed. It was a collaborative entity of these with AIMS. But again, AIMS, partially because of who wound up on the boards and everything else, continued to take a bit of a paternal attitude towards those organizations. And as the operators became more and more invested in the organization and the needs of it, you started having the operators have more community-based models than they had hospital-based models. And for them to basically sit quietly on the sidelines made no sense for them. And so you started to see things like the AMOA, formed with the operators. And so AIMS wound up becoming in a position of trying to sort of juggle the relationships with all of these and trying to be all things to all people. We're starting to become, less efficient being what was there.
I think AIMS a lot had to do with, because when I was on the board for several years too, and then I'm currently on the board. But when I was the president, now called chair, there was, I thought a misunderstanding, because AIMS is a trade association. Trade association is that your company is a member, and then all the other associations were societies, when you look at it from an association perspective. And there was kind of a misunderstanding on what that meant, and especially in sharing some of the proceeds from the Air Medical Transport Conference. And then, of course, in the blow up in, it was 2009 with the ACT, or patient first group breaking off. I think those were some of the most contentious board meetings that I was at, because I was the past president chair at the time. And then you saw a real split over, what became the catalyst was the CON in North Carolina.
Yeah.
Have you been involved at all with ACT at all? Have you, with Association of Critical Care Transport, have you done?
Not really. I mean, obviously, yourself included, I have a lot of friends that are involved in it. And I've never been particularly adversarial towards ACT.
Yeah.
I just, makes my heart ache because we're not big enough to really be, split off at that level. And I really hope for the day that we can figure out how to be able to get back under the same tent. And I think there are reasons to do that and opportunity there, because we're a small industry and we need to have a strong voice. And I think that a strong voice comes from being more united in what we do. I think ACT proved and has proven that there needed to be serious focus on the clinical side of things.
Yes.
Patient quality and all those, and those were emphasis that needed to happen. And I think that AIMS has a important role. I think that ACT has gone ahead and established a area that needs to be focused on. I think, again, each of the societies, you talked about it, are incredibly important for the professions they've got to be able to happen. But we need to figure out how to get that all under a tent again, because, again, our voice is weakened when we split the message.
Yeah, I've been singing that same song, having been involved with both organizations and on the board of both. I think ACT has done incredibly well with clinical standards, the standards that they publish. I think where it's difficult, and my former position with LifeLink, we kept a membership in both organizations, and I'd get criticized from both sides, and it was difficult trying to justify, because they were fighting each other on the Hill over language and bills. And I even had a meeting actually in Minneapolis to bring the executive committees of both organizations together. And I think there is a lot of miscommunication with stuff. So we'll see. I mean, I'd like to see it all under 110. I mean, if you were to create this from scratch, you wouldn't have all these individual associations with medics and stuff. If you look at the American Hospital Association, you have groups underneath that, but it's hard to go back on that. You've go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think there was a real misfire in the leadership at AIMS at the time, basically the time that forced AMOA to form, because you remember there was a very strong challenge coming up to the industry. There was the NTSB that was going to focus, for an entire week on our industry. And there was having to report to Congress and have a talk there. And basically the message that was given to the operators is sort of, don't worry about it. We've got it under control. We're going to go ahead and represent everything. And that's a really scary message to send to people that literally have $1 billion invested in the industry, that it's sort of, go ahead and sit on the sidelines, we'll take care of this. And I think that general attitude as it comes to dealing with everybody is got to stop. There's got to be collaboration if you're going to be able to make these things work.
Right. Yeah. I mean, when I was president chair, it was the CEO group was what that was called before it broke off as a MOA. You've been involved with the MedEvac Foundation International since 2016. Talk about that experience and what types of things you've been working on, or the foundation has been.
Tends to be where I land after I term out of the board. I've been a fair and far also during gaps were there, fair and far being the predecessors to MedEvac International. But again, it's an area of passion of mine. I mean, I think that research is critical for our industry. It's something that it's been difficult to get enough, both financing and direction to be able to do sort of some of the goals that we've got, but I think we're getting better at that. Under Johnny's leadership, we spent some time and really looked at what it was our mission in that. And that through that became the taking care of our own, realizing that that was a significant part of what needed to be done within the industry, that was a sort of an unserved area. Howard Ragsdale's leadership has, expanded on that, and the podcast, or not podcast, but webinar type of things that have been done around the taking care of our own have been, I think, really good. Yep. Obviously, COVID has made it to where that's one of our few tools to be able to deal with it. But the whole issue of just good mental health in the industry is incredibly important. When you look at the suicide rate in EMS, it's embarrassing besides being horrible. And so I think that that's a good focus, for the foundation to be able to do. And then there's just the rest of the mission around education. So, I think that, you're hitting three of my hot buttons there. So it's a great place to be, and I really enjoy it. And under Connie's leadership right now, I think we're going to continue to sail. So.
And how have donations come in? I know there was a big push initially to get people, in the industry. I mean, not only the leaders, but the rank and file to give to the foundation. How is that going? Or is it?
Part of the issue is that there has been a confused message. It's hard to raise money when your message is sort of, there's a lot of neat things we'd like to do, and depending on how much we get, we might be able to do more. I mean, that just doesn't grab your heartstrings like something that is, a clear focus. The taking care of our own is the easier sell because we can define what it is and what the benefit is and what the, the return value is for the folks. We've tended to, as a group, to rely on the internal community, if you will. And, the operators have everybody with their hands out towards them. The manufacturers have everybody with their hands out towards them. And everybody has been stressed financially over the last few years, including Ames and the foundation. And so that's one area that there's some issues with. The other piece is that we've tended to have reasonable looking numbers, but they're because we've taken on specific projects. And so we'll do a project that Bell is sponsoring, or we'll do one that Air Methods is sponsoring, or we'll do one that GMR is sponsoring, or something like that. And those funds then are strictly for that. And so we don't have the ability to sort of go out and seek other creative things. Over the years, they've been able to do a couple of neat studies that would help. They also did the sort of Air Medical 101 project, which was published in multiple languages and talked about how to be able to set up an air medical program. They've helped sponsor some research around sleep studies and that type of stuff. But I think that what we're really working on right now is trying to clean the message so that we've got something that is really a legitimately perceived request to some of the bigger foundations and entities that would be willing to provide bigger money. So part of it is we needed to sort of grow up from being the organization that, I'm obviously exaggerating, but, funds itself through bake sales and silent auctions to something that is, more of a fairly large corporate foundation in order to be able to fund the opportunities that we have.
Yeah, that's great that you're involved with that. One area when we were preparing for the podcast, I didn't realize that you were on the board as the professional flight chaplains since 2014. I know I have talked to some folks from that group, but tell us what the group's working on and what their goals are.
Amelie is the person who started it. She was a flight chaplain with Flight for Life in Denver, and she is just a force of nature that you can't say no to. And so she asked me if I'd come on the board, and I really appreciated them and appreciated their mission. Again, it really fits into this sort of taking care of our own. And the flight chaplaincy is secular. It's not it's not a religious type of a mission that's there. The idea is that if you embed a chaplain with an organization, whether it's the Army, a fire department, police departments, any of those type of things, what you provide is a trusted person with skills around being able to help people deal with issues, whether it's, any type of crisis related to work, or it's a divorce, or it's children, or it's whatever. It's having somebody with those skills embedded in the organization, and somebody who can watch what's happening and also help be a moral compass for an organization. I remember talking to Rick, previous president of Ames, and he was a general, and I mean he talked about the value of having a chaplain, even in the military, because it then provided a degree of conscience and support, for the military as far as their compass, to where to go. So I like their mission. I think it's a neat process. I thoroughly enjoy the other board members and the chance to be able to work with them. And I think our biggest thing now is just to try to promote the concept enough and get some flight chaplains out there in some of these other hospitals and programs. And
how many programs actually have a flight chaplain?
Yeah, I should have that on the top of my head, but I mean, it's less than a dozen that I know of.
Yeah.
I know of several of the bigger programs that are currently looking at it. I know of at least 2 that have it in their budget, but have not yet found the person. And part of it also is just the training. And that's another one of the big things that the chaplains do, is they provide training and continuing education for this, because it's a different type of chaplaincy. That they need to be able to understand what they're dealing with trauma, and what they're dealing with stress syndromes that are associated with people that are constantly in trauma, and that type of stuff. And so,
it's the everyday. I mean, a tough flight
right.
that someone comes back from. I know when I was at Duke when they crashed the first time, and I remember the pastoral care department at the hospital provided the greatest support for our group and me. I mean, it was really right.
Yeah, one of my roles at Air Methods was to be one of the first in anytime we had a fatal accident. And I was responsible then for meeting with the families and setting up the memorial services.
That's right.
There were unfortunately a lot of those. And, it was interesting because, as you said, if a program or the hospital had a chaplaincy or pastoral area, it was just a godsend to be able to work with them. And frequently, if they didn't, I had to find somebody with those type of skills to be able to help us get through that period. I mean, the crisis teams that would come in and stuff were good for part of that, but you really needed the empathy that would come through with that type of a group. And so that was really important. And then personally, part of the trauma, if you will, of dealing with one of those accidents is that after the service was done and everybody had, had their closure, then I had to process it. And it really, really helped to have a person that I could go to that could help.
I remember you talking at or being quoted at so many of those. That's you also are involved. I don't know how you have time to do all these things. The National EMS Memorial Service as typically as financial as treasurer. Yeah. So tell us what that's all about.
Again, it's, I have a area of my heart that's really tied to the families and the coworkers and all that type of stuff that have to deal with a line of duty death. I mean, the person that's died is significant, and obviously very important. And I like the fact that we're honoring them as it goes forward. But the truth is that memorials and honoring and like this is for the survivors, not for the person who died.
Yes.
And I think it's whether some of the people, for example, that we honor, you look at the accident and you go, that person basically, committed mass murder and suicide because they made a really bad decision and they caused the accident, or you could easily see how it could have been avoided and whatever else. that doesn't change the fact that the mission is still important to be able to deal with. And it doesn't change the fact that their family members and their coworkers and everybody else are grieving. And I think through a memorial service, it's a way of validating that what they were participating in had value and that it wasn't in vain. And the National EMS Memorial Service is the congressionally recognized sort of big service to be able to do that. And we deal with line of duty deaths in EMS. The police have their memorial, the fire departments have theirs. There just wasn't one for EMS. And so we have that. And the interesting thing about it is that the National EMS Memorial Service works collaboratively with the National EMS Memorial Foundation, which is putting together a brick and mortar memorial in the Washington, D.C. area, which is pretty close to happening. And then you've got like the National EMS Bike Ride.
Yes, which I've been involved with. Yeah.
Right. Participates with the service. And it provides an excellent thing because we are limited to only honor line of duty deaths, and we use the PSOB standards to be able to decide who that is. But there are a lot of people who die in our industry that are worthy of honors, but not necessarily a line of duty death.
Yes.
And so the National EMS Bike Ride goes ahead and provides the outlet for honoring those people too. And so it's a collaboration between the three. And
yeah, I didn't realize, because I got involved with the National EMS Memorial Bike Ride. Tammy Chapman, it's always doing a lot of the picture taking and stuff, and said, you got to do this. You like biking. And it was such a moving experience to do that. I mean, it's bicycling, but it's in the stops that you make and meeting people in EMS and honoring those that were lost, and then meeting some of the family members of those that were lost. It's I haven't done the East Coast ride, which rides into the memorial service, but I've done the Midwest ride. But even that is an incredible. I've told more people to do that and served on the board for a couple of years too. Let's move on to an area that I know you know a lot about, which is in the financial area. I know you were involved. I'm going to combine these, the negotiated rulemaking, and I don't want to get into all the details with that. That was back in the late 90s. But the big issue now is this balanced billing legislation that was passed at the end of last year. And now really the process and how this is all going to be put in place and how it's going to be done, I believe still January 2022. And this is affecting many areas of healthcare. It's not just air medical, but, as you said earlier, the pricing, that you could just charge whatever you want. Well, that seems like that's going to be coming to an end, or it's, I know a lot of the companies now are trying to be in network. The programs I've worked at, we sort of always did that, but I know some of the big national ones, partially because you're negotiating with every state and every insurance company. But what's your thoughts on the whole balance billing thing, and how do you think that's going to affect our industry?
I think one of the important things to understand also, it is a recent event that you're seeing some of the big operators go in network as much as they are.
Yes.
But some of the biggest insurance companies aren't willing to go in network for the operators. In other words, the operators are making offers and getting silence from the big insurance companies. And I think part of it is they're waiting to see how this plays out.
Well, that's what I was wondering, if it's going to, even the ones that were in network are saying, I don't want to be in network anymore.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how they deal with it. And part of it, quite frankly, ties back to what you talked about with the negotiated rulemaking in the late 90s. I mean, the problem was that we didn't have any data to work with. We had the cost reports from the hospitals, but they were only a small sort of picture relative to the air medical because so many of the costs were in other areas of the cost report. And so we didn't have good cost information. There were very few independent programs at the time that had clean financials to be able to work with. And ultimately what we did was we negotiated a slice of the pie that we had to imagine, because HCFA that now became CMS, HCFA couldn't define how much they'd been paying. So we sort of imagined a pie that HICFA said, yeah, probably. And then we got a slice of it, but it wasn't based on cost. It wasn't based on any reality, but it was also something that we could live with when we had, 10%, 20% of the current number of our medical programs are out there, and the volumes were relatively high. And Medicare certainly has not kept up even with inflationary pressure since that point in time. So that's a big part of why the charges kept going up. I find it interesting that when I printed out the bill, which was a COVID relief bill, it was about 1,400 pages on my computer. Almost half of those were, 400, so less than half, I guess. But anyway, about 400 pages were related to balance billing. And of that 470 of them were related to air ambulance specifically.
Yeah.
So, we certainly caught the attention of somebody to be able to wind up with that much attention in the bill. I think that there's a lot of things that are going to have to happen. And I think that we're going to maybe go through a difficult point here while we try to decide how we're going to, live in our new environment and with our new diet, if you will, to be able to work with. The first thing is we're going to have to decide what we want in the way of access. You're not going to be able to have a program operating in central Wyoming, where there's 500,000 people in the entire state, and operating at 15 or 14, 12, whatever it would be, flights a month, and be able to do so with an average charge that's going to be somewhere around, $25,000, $30,000. It just
Right.
isn't going to happen.
Right.
So we're going to have to decide, is the cost of doing business in the area reasonable when you're starting to look at volume? If you're going to look at volume, then you got to ask the question, does it make any sense to have two aircraft sitting in a community providing services where, between them, they're each getting 15 flights a month, but there really could be 30 flights a month, which would then be a viable program. And that is a really hard decision to be able to deal with, because if you start getting into that type of decision, the only entity right now in the structure we've got that could do it would be the federal government. And so the federal government would have to set up some means, similar like to what they did with MAX or other things like that, to be able to make a decision on distribution. And I don't know if they're ready to, if there's the political will to get to that. But access is going to be something they have to think about.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that may happen is that finally, people may understand what it takes to provide one of these services. Again, if you look at the cost of providing a service, and you figure in the overhead that's necessary to be able to make it there, so you fully burden it, and then you go ahead and realize that you've got Medicare fixed, you've got Medicaid fixed, and you've got self-pay, which is almost nothing. And most programs, that's well past 50% of their payer mix.
And growing, Medicare.
And growing, absolutely growing. And so if you go ahead and you take those and you divide the volume that you've got into the expense of providing the service, offset it with those, then you really are looking at a $35,000, $40,000 type of a bill that has to happen so that you can net an average that's going to pay for the service. And I think the insurance companies may be a little surprised in the IRB process, because I think they may find out just how expensive this is and how justified the charges are.
Yeah, I think, as an industry, we were our own worst enemy. Because when these programs first started, they were billing ground ambulance rates, and it was looked at by the hospital as a marketing thing. I got my name on it. And when we went through, the whole, after the negotiated rulemaking, I kept saying, we need to really get down to what our costs are. And right. I think the other problem with, on two sides of this is that on the hospital-based programs, and having been at both independent or hospital-based, it's so hard to know what your dang costs are. Everything's all over the place. I've gone into places and they say, oh yeah, we're doing great. And I go, well, what are you measuring? And, right. Usually hospitals, all you manage is the expense, not the reimbursement. And I know when I went to Duke, that was I really tried to get them to look at the charges. And I said, this is way under what this is really costing. But it's so hard unless the hospital has really good cost accounting to know what exactly that program costs. And then you have, I think, some of the criticism of the for-profit programs then would be, okay, maybe you have a good cost sheet, but then how much money is going to investors, and if you cut out that, or at least part of that, I just felt when we did negotiation with Blue Cross in Minnesota, when I was at LifeLink, I think it was a realization to them that this is a true cost, because I said, we're completely independent. There's no money coming from the hospitals. This is what it's costing us. And we've got, good flight volumes, and we're certainly not spending a lot of money on unnecessary things. But that's the problem, is getting that cost. And
Right.
it's so different. And then you look at each helicopter,
Right.
just the helicopters themselves and how much they cost. And,
You bring up an interesting point too, and that is the ownership type of an idea. With a hospital is looked at it basically as a loss leader, and most of them still do.
Yep.
And they charge below that. When you look at a publicly traded company like Air Methods was before they were acquired, you're dealing with a company where, unless they issue a dividend, the money is actually all still going within the company. The value to the investors is the increased value of the stock. So
right.
their payout is dealing with the trading of the stock between other people, and that never was money that was going to be operational to the entity. So the public model is actually relatively pure in that way. But what's now happened is that most of them are either privately owned, which is rare, or private equity owned. And in the private equity, their goal is, again, to basically get as high a value as they can in the organization. They may take some dividends during that time, but they're also basically building a company to be able to go either public again, or to go ahead and sell to another entity to be able to deal with it. And so, there's lots of reasons why people are concerned about private equity and healthcare and the mission. The thing I find amazing about what's happening right now is whether you look at, where you were with LifeLink 3, if you look at the LifeLink network up in the Northwest, if you look at what Intermountain Healthcare has just done with their acquisition of Classic and the huge footprint, that puts them in 8 states, plus 2, another country and a territory.
Yeah, I didn't realize that. Yeah.
You look at MedEvac, you look at, Boston MedFlight, whatever. These are all not-for-profit entities that are flourishing in this certain area, and most of them are doing so because they've actually come up with a business model that allows them to be able to deal with it, and because of the way their need or lack thereof of having to hit the same type of profit margins that were required for either a public company or a private equity group. So I think that evolution is very interesting, but these big not-for-profits are not in business to lose money. They are in business to be able to continue their mission. And that
you've got to have a margin to capitalize things.
No margin, no mission.
That's
Sister
right.
Myra James used to tell me that all the time.
Yes, right. I remember that, your quote on that. Well, I know we could talk about balanced billing for a long time, but it's going to be interesting how this all shakes out this year.
It's really critical that as we go into the IRB process, that people are well prepared and that they understand how to communicate the costs. That's the important piece.
Yeah. Let's talk about the medical transport leadership. You and I both were founding regents and instructors, and this is evolved to be a really successful program now. 20 plus years ago, I think I remember saying to you when we were preparing this, I thought at the time that, there was how many programs, so we're going to be out of business in 3 years, we'll train all the administrators. So what do you believe is the reason for the success, and how has MTLI changed over the years?
Like you, I'm incredibly proud of that. If you were to ask me to, stick my finger on the thing that in my career I probably have the greatest personal pride in, it is MTLI. It's really an excellent school. It's, that initial group of us that met, it was five of us. But anyway, we got together. We were talking about the problem was that as things were growing and programs were getting bigger, people were being promoted into the roles of program directors that generally had strong clinical backgrounds because
Right.
they were an employee of the hospital where others in the program frequently weren't. And you were having people that were poorly prepared to be in management finding themselves in very serious management roles. I mean, they'd never read a set of financials. They didn't know what a balance sheet was or how to be able to deal with it. They, had a limited understanding when it came to some of the rules and regulations that are around HR. They didn't know how you'd finance an aircraft if you were to go ahead and buy one. They didn't understand, aircraft leasing and those type of things. And so what we thought was we tried to put together a mini MBA type of thing to be able to get people going. And I think what happened was we wound up with a lot of the leadership of the industry coming there, but the leadership that came, being good leaders, realized they needed to start, building that strength behind them. And so what we saw was somebody would come from a program that was in a leadership role, and the next year, 3 people from that program would show up. And then what we started seeing was job descriptions that would come out where somebody was being hired for something, it would say CMTE preferred. And I think one of the great values of the program, almost beyond the education, is the networking that happens, because everybody that comes to that school, the instructors included, leaves their logo wear at the door. We don't worry about who's with what program, who's got what, going on. And you see competitors sitting down together working on a project to be able to get things done. I think that the collaboration and the networking that comes from that is just incredibly valuable. I remember talking to a person that I encouraged to go to it. And, she said, well, I don't think I'm, capable of this type of management. And when she got done with the school, it wasn't so much the education, it was the fact that she was able to go ahead and say, wow, these other people are just like me, and sure, I'll give it a shot. I'll work at it. So that was a piece of it. I think that all can be a value there, and so it's just good, and it's got a good reputation, and I think that it's very, very collaborative, and I think that all helps.
Yeah, I think Ogilvy certainly helped us to put that together in initially funding it all, and but in looking at the curriculum, I think if we would just have done that ourselves, it would have been, what's the latest thing? So you do balanced billing this year or something. That's not the core. It's really they had the campground school, they had a golf PGA school, and we look. I remember we pulled out all their curriculum stuff, and it was very similar. It was on marketing, government relations, finance, strategic planning, HR types of things, and I think that has really been a key to success too. It was always my favorite work week of the year. I mean, it was fun. And what I did, I was not one to send multiple people for 1 year from the organization. I'd say there's going to be one first year student and one second year, because the first and second year you hardly see each other because you're so busy in the second year. But I said the purpose is to network and meet people. And those are career-long, relationships that you have with people. And I said, I don't want you hanging around, because I do remember some groups would send 5, 6 people, but all they do is hang around together. Well, you already do that. Learn something new, bring something back from, one of the for-profit programs, or, learn what they do. And things seem to be going really well. I think it was sad, some of the changes that I think Rick Sherlock forced, that Denise and some of the others left, because I really don't, even though it is an Ames thing, it really is for the whole community, everyone, and it would have been better to keep everyone involved. But it's nice. I'm glad Ed Marasco stepped up and chaired for a while, and then Tom Lieberman now is doing things. So I think it's going. And you had said, I think too, is that it's a good mix of folks that have been there from the beginning to people that have been there for several years, and now some new folks coming in. And so.
Yeah, we obviously, just like in Indy management, you need to have a succession plan and start moving.
Yeah.
So,
and that's something we probably could have done a little bit better job at the very beginning, because we all liked it so much, and it was so successful. So, you had told me, I hadn't realized that Bob Freitas, one of our original regents, had passed away last year. With COVID and stuff, you don't hear about it. And so you just want to talk about what we're going to be doing?
Yeah, well, I mean, we're going to kind of have a Zoom wake for him, if you will. We're going to honor him and get the regents together from, the very beginning to the folks that are there now, and just, tell some stories and remind us what it was like. He was a pretty spectacular person. He had a great spirit. Part of his shtick was being sort of a curmudgeon, but it really wasn't his soul.
Yeah.
And, he was a real force in helping us get this thing up and going. So
absolutely. Yeah. The thing about Bob is it seems like he could teach anything. And he always had, we had, and I don't know if you're still doing that, but you get the scores and how people have rated the classes, and we were all very high. I mean, it wasn't like, anybody was really sucking at the thing, but Bob was always the highest, the highest. Yeah. And it was, it would drive us all crazy, but it just had a good rapport. And you told me then you and I worked on putting together this program for the regents and instructors. On June 10th, I put together, we got some of the pictures of him, put together a little video that we'll be playing. So, and you still teach financial management, right, at the school. Yeah. So I know
it's become a 2-hour lecture. It's great fun to try to keep people focused on finance for 2 hours, but again, it's scoring well. So I guess it's meeting somebody's needs.
Well, I think what you need to require, since we're over almost 2.5 hours right now, that they are required to listen to this podcast too, as well as your 2-hour lecture. Learn a little bit more about you. So the funniest story I have about you at MTLI is that when I was, in charge of groups in the second year, and they'd always, you'd have to present like you're presenting to a board of directors, and it would be the other regents and instructors that would be sitting up there, and that it'd all be scared as that Craig Yale's not going to be on our panel. And I said, I think he is. And, they were always so scared. And so you got the reputation, we called you the shark, and you were so good at you are so good about the details on financials. If there's one little thing, and I called that, if there's a little blood in the water, he's going to go after it. And so we better be prepared. And I think it helped people be better prepared for the financial thing. So that was fun. So
I remember one of the students who I have great respect for, but they had a major problem in the way that they set up their financials, and it just wasn't real. And unfortunately, their outcome was based on this financial. And so I was pointing out the issue and asking questions around it. I wanted to have it be a teaching moment when people could understand why that wasn't going to work and how it affected everything else that was there. It wasn't, as you know, it isn't a fail because there's a problem with your piece. It's supposed to be learning. But I remember this particular student looking at me, and I thought, he wants to kill me.
Yeah. Hence the shark. Yeah. So you, I know you've written a lot of articles, and you one piece I wanted you to talk about is the Air Medical Physicians Association Handbook. You've written the financial chapters in that. How did you become involved with that?
Again, another force of nature is Ira Bloom, and Ira was the person who was putting that all together. And Ira came to me and asked me if I'd write the financial chapter, and I enjoyed doing it. It was nice to go through a really serious editing process, and then when the second one came out, he asked me if I would go ahead and write that chapter, or at least review the one I had and make any adjustments. So, the wonderful thing about finance is that it's not changing a whole lot at the level that we have to deal with it. There are changes in GAAP each year and stuff like that, but it's still pretty straightforward.
Yeah. So is it written for a physician to understand finance? Is that the purpose?
The whole textbook, I mean, if you've ever seen it, it's like, it's like 1.5 inches, 2 inches thick. It's quite a book. And it's sort of like MTLI in a book for paramedical physicians. I mean, it's a book that has all sorts of information in it that somebody who finds themselves as a medical director for a flight program, or for that matter, ground ambulance program,
To understand.
It gives them tools to be able to look at, to understand the uniqueness of the industry and what it is that they need to understand as the medical director. And so finance, we felt, was an important area for them to be able to have an understanding of, because it's not a big part of their education. And a lot of times these medical directors wind up being sort of the backup, if you will, to the program director when it comes to the program management. And for them to have a credible understanding of finance helps them when they're dealing with administration in the hospitals and stuff.
Yeah. Well, that's fantastic. 2016, you had one of the highest honors in our industry with the Marriott Carlson Lifetime Achievement Award. Congratulations. I know that's quite an honor. And I will have a link to the video of that in the podcast notes on the webpage. But that must have meant quite a lot to you, getting that.
Yeah, it did. I when I was younger, I'd watch people get the awards and think that's great, but it didn't. I remember Michelle North, and many people will, wonderful lady, but she died way too young.
Yes.
She was quoted as saying, "I'll come back and haunt you if you name an award after me." And I think that tends to be the way people think. But when you get towards the latter part of your career and everything else, it's really, really nice to be recognized that what you've done has made a difference and that people think there's value to it. And so, I mean, it is a real amazing honor. But I got to tell you, the biggest honor for me when it came to that was not getting the award. It was who nominated me. Russ Spray nominated me for the award, and I have just massive admiration for that man. I mean, he was a mentor, a friend, an incredible leader in the industry. And I just, like I said, the fact that Russ nominated me touched my heart the strongest in the whole thing. But I'm certainly appreciative of having been recognized. Thanks.
Yeah, that was great. I remember that year. Well, let's talk a little bit about your personal life. Where are you originally from?
By pure coincidence, I was born in Salt Lake City. My dad was doing a sort of a residency here, and he was in the second class out of Minnesota, the University of Minnesota. And
Sure.
And so, being in the second class, just like the first class guys, they weren't really sure what to do with them. And so one of the things they did was that they had to go do sort of a preceptorship at a hospital somewhere. And Dad wound up here in Salt Lake. And so it happened to be when I was born. When I was about 6 months old, we moved to Sheridan, Wyoming, and I grew up in Sheridan, Wyoming. Dad was CEO there of that hospital for like 38 years.
Wow.
And retired from there. Went to the University of Wyoming, married my wife, went to Colorado following hers down to Colorado Springs, was there for about 20 some odd years, and moved over here to Utah again for Rocky. And, with the exception of the 5 years with Turkey, I've been here, and we've been here 22 years now. So
Yeah.
this is now home again.
So even when you were with Air Methods, you stayed in Salt Lake.
I did. It was one of those things that was sort of funny because I moved to Salt Lake, to Sandy, actually, where I live.
Yep.
Because I felt disconnected from what was going on in the corporation at Rocky. And I was commuting back and forth from Colorado Springs, and that was okay with them, but I felt like I was just missing out on too much of what was being decided in the hallways, in casual conversation. I needed to be here. I came here, and then a couple of years later, we were bought by Air Methods, and then I was commuting back to a corporation that was about 40 minutes from my old home in Colorado Springs. But it had been a very painful thing to pull up roots, and my daughters were both in the junior high school type age group.
Yeah, tough.
And I just wasn't going to do it to them again. Yeah. And one of the things I found was that not being based in Denver allowed me to be freer to be able to go out and deal with the issues that were out there. So I was traveling like 250 days a year, literally almost every Monday through Friday, somewhere dealing with something. But I didn't have an anchor at my desk in Denver because of not living there. And so I think it helped with what I was being asked to do. I also would frequently stop in Denver. I mean, I did have a desk there so that I could stay involved, but it was also part of the management style of that senior team that really allowed us to be more decentralized. And so it worked. And so, occasionally I was kidded for being the only person on the senior team that didn't live there. I remember being in China one time and having the person that was there talk about me needing to get there soon and that they would get an apartment set up and whatever. And Aaron just robustly laughing, he said, "Look, I can't get him to move to Denver. You think you're going to get him to move to Beijing?"
Yeah.
And so actually the move to Istanbul was quite a surprise.
Yeah. So did you keep a residence in the US? And then
my wife would do 2 months here in the States and 2 months with me in Istanbul, and just going back and forth. But we had pets and everything else. I mean, there was a need to have foot still here, and quite frankly, it helped even when it came to all the issues around taxes and everything else to have a permanent residence here.
Well, talk about your children. What are they doing now?
I've got two daughters. One is a kindergarten teacher, and following her passion, she has just amazing empathy with kids, and so very proud of that. And then my other daughter is a PA. She's works out in Bellingham, Washington, and she's, part of what I think she would tell you that she chose being a PA over going to med school was the independence that it gives you. You don't wind up getting tied to a single practice. You have the ability to sort of do other things. You don't have to overly specialize. I mean, she was dealing with neuromuscular diseases and stuff for a long time, and that was sort of her specialty. She's now dealing more with, it's an extended care type of a situation, or not extended care, but a step down from patients that are being moved from a hospital to a place where they still need to have specialty care. And COVID produced an interesting thing with that, in that she, her facility was one of the early ones that was hit with COVID. She wound up with COVID back in March of last year. When she was done with her experience with COVID, personal experience, she was able to come back and be able to work with the patients there, with the assumption that there was some type of relative immunity. Obviously, she was still doing all the precautions and everything else, but it ran through their facility. And when the state of Washington decided that they needed to do something, they basically established 3 facilities that would be receiving facilities for COVID positive patients that were not having to be in the hospital in order to free up beds in the hospital. And so one of her facilities became one of these 3 in the state. And so she wound up having almost all of her patients be patients with active COVID.
Washington State was one of the early ones that was hit, right? That was. Has she had any long-term effects from it?
Yeah, she's had a few things. I mean, I think that that it's probably been a bit of a compromise. She's an extremely active, athletic type of a
Yeah.
person. And I think that she's recognized that there's probably some respiratory deficit as far as just respiratory function, that she's working hard on getting back and that type of stuff. She had an extended period where she had a little bit of almost a Bell's palsy type of a thing that was sort of a piece of it. But I would say she's recovered well. She's, fortunately not having all the issues that some people are
Yeah,
having.
that's good. Yeah, because there's all kinds of, I mean, by and large, people recover, but then there's all these other cases, long-term things. So, and your wife, is she still working or?
Yes. My wife is, she's a med tech. She is actively involved in laboratory stuff. She wound up becoming part of what was necessary to be able to bring the IT side into the lab, and she's been focusing on that for a long time. Officially, her last day as a full-time employee was the end of this month, or last month actually. But because she's so active on some of the projects and stuff, she's still doing it on a PRN basis. So
yeah. So just one more question. I know you're very. I didn't know this about you until I think several years after I first knew you, how much you like music and that you play instruments and woodworking, collecting vintage VWs. I know you have a picture of some of your VWs, and traveling, of course, and then your newest thing is here a kayaking adventure. I know when I was talking to you, you were putting together the kayak. So talk about your other joys in life.
Well, music's a big piece of it for me. Here are my Volkswagens.
Yeah.
And, anyway, music's always been a really big piece for me since I was a young boy. And I enjoy both music and quality instruments. And so that has resulted in an obsession. And fortunately, I have an indulgent wife who allows me to follow my obsessions. I have, for example, 5 pianos. I probably have 9 guitars.
Oh
I have a sitar, I have banjo, I have a bouzouki from Greece, I have an oud from the Middle East, I have a demburka, I have a kanun from Turkey, I have a gazang from China. And I mean, I'm barely scratching the surface, but these are all instruments that I generally picked up in countries that I was either working in or visiting. And so I have a huge collection that someday my children are going to have to sell at a garage sale or something. But
so what type of guitars do you have? I'm interested in that.
All acoustic.
Acoustic, okay.
Yeah, they're all acoustic. I mean, I've got a Big Body Guild 12. I've got a very interesting guitar that was called a Giannini. It's got a unique shape to it. I've got one of the original Ovations while they were still being made in the United States. Beautiful instrument. I've got a Martin D41 or D31. Yeah, there we go. It's the high-end Martin, but without the extra flourish on the mother of pearl stuff. Again, just a gorgeous instrument. I've got a classical guitar.
Is that the type of music you play? Is it more classical or?
To be honest with you, it's probably more 70s, 60s type stuff. I mean, fair amount of folk, a little bit of on the guitar anyway. It's mostly in that area. On the piano, it tends to be a little bit more fusion jazz, or maybe even what you might call new age music. That tends to make a picture that's not quite what I want to say, but some David Lance and that type of stuff.
That's great. It's I more left brained, and I wanted to get over there on the right side, so I picked up. Been playing bass guitar for maybe 10 and a half years now or so, and play with some groups and still learning stuff. In fact, I was just reading an article about Prince, who's from the Minneapolis area, and what an accomplished musician. I mean, his initial records, he played every instrument, and
Right.
he's an incredible bass player, and you don't know him for being a bass player, but it's been fun playing music and learning and getting into it. I'm sort of taking lessons from Fender has lessons online that I do, and then I play with COVID and stuff. I play with a good friend of mine, is a physician up in Duluth area, and we play through a thing called Jazz Kazam, and you can play through your computer. You get this set and you hook everything in, and it works really well. It improves. So on the VWs, I was going to ask you, so the people that are listening to the podcast aren't seeing these pictures, but you have to go to the video podcast. Craig has put up different pictures as his background. So what year are those two, the bus and the VW?
Yeah, the bus is a 67.
Wow.
And it's fully original, split window, what they call a 13-window bus. And I made it to be as close as I possibly can to what it would have looked like when it came off the factory floor. The Bug, on the other hand, is a 71 Super Beetle, a Durable.
71, okay.
But it has everything. It has a Volkswagen body sort of stuck on top of an amazing piece of engineered work. There is a group out in Ventura, California called Airheads, and they built this car, and it has basically everything you could do to one. It's got Porsche wheels on it. It's been lowered. It's been narrowed. It's been, stuff I don't even know. I mean, channeled, fixed, et cetera, et cetera. Big torsion bar put in it to be able to deal with it. The advantage of the Super Beetle is it actually has a McPherson strut front end, so it can handle the power they put in it. Normal Volkswagen engines around 1600 cc's. This one is 2332.
Wow.
Instead of 50 horsepower, this one's approaching 200 horsepower. So it's a kind of an insane vehicle. So it's everything custom as opposed to the other one, which is everything stock.
Yeah. I always liked the Bug. I actually had one, I think 1970 or around there. I thought, they brought it back, and I thought some of the styling was fabulous. They really looked nice, but then they've abruptly said they're not going to build them anymore.
Yeah.
Did you see that? I thought, wow. Maybe they just weren't selling. I don't know what the problem was.
Selling. It's just Volkswagen, has changed so dramatically. When these vehicles were being produced, they were being produced as a relatively low cost, vehicle for the masses type of a thing. And Volkswagen's been very successful in their growth, and they, are producing really quality cars and everything else. But I think the thing is that they're, at last I heard, they're the number one largest auto manufacturer in the world now. And I think they just got to the point where their market is different, and that's probably why. I mean, you see they're trying to bring back something that's the bus too.
Yes,
and that's supposed to be actually available shortly, but the price is going to be just sky high. It's going to be way up there with the Sprinters and everything else. And so, I don't know. We'll see. But I think the thing is if you do get the Volkswagen Bug, it's and I mean infection, not the bug, but if you get that, it becomes just a lifelong, passion. And so
that's great.
It's fascinating to go to the club meets and different things like that, because it just tends to be a unique group of people that are into Volkswagens. And as a friend of mine from Switzerland said, you either love them or you don't get it. There's no in between.
Yeah. Well, Craig, I know we've been talking a long time here, but is there anything else that we might not have mentioned that you wanted to cover before we?
No, I think the only thing is what I would sort of close anything with, and that is that, this is a necessary, good, and honorable industry and profession that we've had the chance to be part of. And it requires focus. It requires remembering what it is, remembering why we're doing it, and that's the patient. And so keeping it patient-centric, I think, is really critical for our success and our future that's there. And the other thing is that we cannot lose focus on the safety side of things, because we do no good if we're not able to provide the service or if we wind up killing our patient. So, again, understand the responsibility. It is really important, but it's really worth it too.
Yeah, wow, that's excellent closing words, because safety and patient care, I just love when programs talk about patient care stories. And it seems, I follow all the air medical news and stuff, and it seems like there's more patient stories that come out of Europe
Mm-hmm.
and England than here. And there's some really good ones here. And I know some people have tried to do that, and some programs do a good job. So, well, Craig, thank you so much. I know it's been a long time out of your day. You should be either working on your kayak or doing some consulting. So thanks so much for being on the podcast today.
You bet. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Air Medical Today podcast. Please come back again and also subscribe to future shows by visiting the website at airmedtoday.com, iTunes, or the Air Medical Today YouTube channel. Air Medical Today is also on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Pinterest, and Instagram, and you can find the links on the website. Remember, if you would like to sponsor or provide feedback, please write to webmaster@airmedtoday.com or call 612-367-6052. Special thanks to Stanley Reeves of Room Tunes for providing his song, Track 5, for the use as the theme song of the podcast. You can follow Stan on Facebook at facebook.com/stanley.reeves.39. Take care and fly safe.